Good evening, everyone, and welcome to 30 minutes of Torah study for the Torah portion of Vayishlach. The bar mitzvah for a boy, the bat mitzvah for a girl, definitely one of the most significant days in the life of a young man, the life of a young woman. What's interesting about the ceremony of a bar and bat mitzvah is the age when it takes place. 13, 12, this is when you become a man. This is when you become a woman. Yet if you look at most other countries, most other cultures, you do not become a woman at 12, you do not become a man at 13. Depending on what you're trying to accomplish, you want to drive a car, maybe it's going to be 16. You want to buy cigarettes, you want to go into the army, it's going to be 18. You want to vote, you want to buy alcohol, right? There are different ages going all the way up to 21. Based on the Torah perspective, of a woman at the age of 12 and a man at the age of 13, would you advocate that we should allow voting at bar mitzvah? Would you advocate we should allow people to go into the military at bar and bat mitzvah? Would you advocate that the bas mitzvah present should be a set of keys to your very own car? I highly doubt it. So where did we come up with this number? Bar mitzvah boy 13, a girl 12, right? What is the source for this information? And ultimately, what is going to be the impact of that source on Jewish identity and what it means to be a Jew? So we go to this week's Torah portion, and we have the story of Dinah. Dinah is the daughter of Yaakov. She is walking through the city of Shechem, where she is abducted. She is kidnapped by Shechem, the prince who the town is named for, and she is brutally raped. Shechem falls in love with her. He does not want this to be a one-time event, a one-time experience. He wants to marry Dinah. So he approaches her father, Yaakov, the brothers, the family, and says, let us get married. Let our family, your family, connect with each other. We'll intermarry with each other. We'll do business with each other. It'll be a beautiful thing. The children of Yaakov respond that we have this kind of like family tradition thing if you want to be part of our family, and that is a bris. You have to undergo a circumcision. If you all go through a circumcision, then we could marry into each other, then we could do business, and we'll be a big, large family. The people of the town of Shechem agree. They accept, and they all are circumcised. Now let's go to the Parsha. It says, and it came to pass on the third day, when the inhabitants of Shechem were all in pain, that Shimon and Levi, two of Yaakov's sons, brothers of Dinah, each man took up his sword. They came upon the city with confidence, and they slew every man. Yaakov was incensed. He was enraged. His two sons went to a city, they wiped out every man, killed, murdered every single one. These were people that they just made an agreement with. They formed a pact. They were going to intermarry with each other. And he says to them, what's wrong with you? This could lead to a war. How are people around here going to look at us? Who would want to do business with us? Who wants to do anything with us? We go about murdering people that we make deals with. Shimon and Levi respond to their father, and they say, will our sister be made into a harlot? Could we allow our sister to be treated this way? Impossible. There is no way we could allow our sister to be abused in this fashion, and then for it to be somehow justified and smoothed over, and then we're having weddings and business deals and parties. It's not going to happen. The anger of Shimon and Levi is very understandable, as you might feel the same way if, God forbid, this happened to your sister. Understandable, yes, but is it justified? Was it kosher what they did? So let's look at a few of the classic answers that are brought by some of the commentaries. The Rambam writes, the people should have established a court of justice and brought the prince up on charges for what he did. Failure to do so made them all complicit. The Rambam says this was a corrupt society. This was a society that championed the fact that their leader committed a rape and were going to profit as a result. That is not allowed. That's not tolerable. It certainly violates the 7 Noahide laws. And as a community, as a city, they are culpable, and therefore was correct what they did. The Ramban, Nachmanides, he comments, the people were guilty of many other capital sins, such as idolatry, adultery, and other abominations. The Ramban says, don't feel bad for this group of people who were in pain as a result of their circumcision and were wiped out by Shimon and Levi. These were evil, corrupt, idolatrous, adulterous, abominable people, and they deserve to be wiped out no matter what. Another approach is given by the Or HaChaim. He writes that they intended to kill Shechem only. They wanted to kill Shechem, the rapist. But the people came to his defense, and they found themselves in a war against the entire male population. So they didn't set out to wipe out every male, but the result was they wiped out every male because they came to defend their prince Shechem. The result is they were defeated. Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, in his book Hektav HaKabbalah, he writes that Shimon and Levi learned that the population came to regret their circumcision and were preparing to make war against Yaakov's family. So from his approach, the people of Shechem, they said, why did we do this? Why did we become circumcised? So Shechem should marry into this family? We could wipe out this family in 2 seconds. It's one family. We're a whole city. We could take all their property. Shimon and Levi heard about this. They said, we have to take advantage of the time that they are in pain, and they wiped them out. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree with these approaches, but any way you look at it, you have to be on some level impressed with Shimon and Levi. They defended the honor of their sister. They risked war with neighboring towns. They risked offending their father. Why? To stand up for the honor of their sister. Which leads to the next question. How old were Shimon and Levi at this point? When Shimon and Levi carried out this attack on the people of Shechem, how old were they? So the Rashi comments here based on the Talmud that in all the Torah, we find no instance in which someone younger than 13 is called a man. However, we do find that the Torah describes a 13-year-old as a man. As the passage states, and Shimon and Levi, 2 of Jacob's sons, each man took up his sword. We have it by tradition that Shimon and Levi were 13 years old at that point. One who wants to calculate it may calculate it, and will conclude that they were indeed 13. If you do the math, when they were born, the age that they were at this time, you will find that Shimon and Levi were both 13 years old. They were born in the same year, as it does happen. Sometimes you have a child, 2 children born in a 12-month period. Shimon and Levi were both 13 years old at the time. As 13-year-olds, they had the confidence, they had the strength, they had the resolve to pursue justice for their sister Dinah. From here we learn, when does a boy become a man? At the age of 13, as Shimon and Levi are called in the Torah a man. That is the source. But this leads us to 3 questions. Question number 1, why 13? They're not mature at this age. We understand that the Torah used the term man to describe people who are 13. But in no real world sense could you describe a 13-year-old boy as someone who is an adult, someone who is mature, someone who's capable of making serious, important life decisions, as no other country in the world recognizes the age of 13 as being an adult. So fine, the Torah uses it, but why 13? How does this make sense? Question number 2, why learn that a boy becomes a bar mitzvah at 13, which means they're obligated and responsible for Torah, for mitzvahs, to make a minyan, to put on tefillin, kosher, Shabbos, everything, from such a bloody and violent episode? Wouldn't it be much more appropriate if we learn that a bar mitzvah boy is at the age of 13 because the Torah describes a Kohen bringing a sacrifice in the temple? right? Some beautiful mitzvah, some spiritual act. Why do we learn it from a violent episode? And question number 3, why do other nations have other ages? If we're going to argue from a Torah perspective that 13 is significant, that does make a person a man, why are we the only nation that has this age? Why isn't the legal age to vote in the United States 13? Why isn't the legal age to buy alcohol not 13? How come this did not catch on in other countries? Why is there a difference? So the first answer that we have to give is that it's pretty clear and obvious that when the Torah says a 13-year-old is a man and then a 12-year-old girl is a woman, we do not mean a fully mature adult that is capable of making all the decisions that a fully mature adult is capable of making. That is clear and obvious. That is not the case. Nobody would accuse any 13-year-old or 12-year-old of being on that level. However, maturation is a process that takes a few years. The journey begins at this age. Fully functioning adult, not yet. But at the age of 13, at the age of 12, this is where the process begins to adulthood. Now, the Rebbe writes something very interesting about what this means, that the process begins, what takes place at the age of 13. The Rebbe writes that the commandments become obligatory at the age of 13 because that is when we reach maturity in terms of understanding and empathy. So the Rebbe says a 13-year-old is not a fully functioning adult. You do not want them deciding who's the president and things of that nature. However, what begins at the age of 13? What are they capable of? There is a certain understanding that they have, and there's a certain empathy that they have. Now, what do I mean by that? At the age of 13, for a boy, at the age of 12 for a girl, they develop the ability to empathize. This is not intellectual prowess. We are not talking fully mature adult can make real decisions. We're talking about emotional intelligence. There's an emotional intelligence that begins, which allows the child to begin to relate to things outside of oneself. Now look how the Rebbe Rashab explains it, the 5th Chabad Rebbe. He writes, to empathize is to really know. One can have a concrete understanding of something and still be unable to experience it emotionally. For example, wise children can understand something well, but they can't experience it emotionally. Despite being intellectually sharp and smart, this is because children lack the ability to really know, namely to develop emotional intimacy and feel the subject on a personal and emotional level. The same applies to worldly affairs, such as wealth or power. Children might be bright and smart. They might understand wealth and power, but they aren't emotionally attached to it. They don't have the same relationship with money that adults do. Now, I think we can readily understand this when it comes to money. You have some kids real smart, real bright, real quick, but they don't understand what money is. They heard about it, they're familiar with it, but when they ask you to buy them things, they want to go on Amazon, they don't understand how money comes, how money goes. They don't have that relationship with it. The same is true of the other side of the coin. Children might understand the problems associated with loneliness and poverty, but they aren't distressed by such problems. They don't feel them as adults do. What this means is children live in their own world, and they tend to worry about things that only affect them. They can understand that there are things that affect other people, but it doesn't bother them, it doesn't hurt them in the same way. They might know about the challenges that other people have, but it doesn't affect them if it's not their challenges. I can tell you firsthand experience from my children, right? When we talk to them, right, about Chava's illness, right, they did not have the same reaction as a Rosie or a Sender as an adult. They wanted to know, is this going to affect our playtime? Right? Is this going to affect our watching time? Because that's their concern. A kid's concern is their own immediate little world. It's hard for them to think outside of that. When a person becomes bar mitzvah, when a person becomes a bas mitzvah, They develop the ability to recognize the challenges of other people, and they're able to empathize. The Rebbe says this does not only apply to empathizing with people, but of course it applies to Torah and mitzvahs. Children lack the ability to perceive and feel how precious and valuable a mitzvah is, and how much we lose when we fail to observe the divine commandments. Children are carefree, right? They don't take a lot of things very seriously. They move on very easily. They go from thing to thing to thing. What is the most important thing? The toy that they're playing with at that moment and at that time. To be obligated to do a mitzvah, we need to be able to feel its gravity and importance. We need to learn how to feel and be moved by something outside of us. For that, we need to develop empathy. For that, we need to be able to appreciate something that's outside of ourselves. We need to appreciate something that's bigger than ourselves, and not just worry about our own personal, individual needs. This is exactly what Shimon and Levi expressed at this time. Empathy. They felt the pain of their sister. They felt the suffering of their sister. They connected with that. They empathized with that. And that is why the Torah describes the bar mitzvah at this age, the ability to empathize, which begins at the age of 13. Shimon and Levi did not act like mature adults. Mature adults probably would not have gone to war with the city of Shechem and wiped out all the adults. But what did Shimon and Levi express beautifully? Empathy. The ability to connect with the pain of another, to understand and appreciate something outside of themselves that was bigger than themselves. That is something that they did exemplify at that time. And this is something which is key to observe Torah and to observe mitzvahs. Now, I'm making this argument so far based on comments of the Rebbe. But what does science have to say? Does science agree that this takes place at this age? Today's leading psychologists assert that children become capable of abstract thought and empathy as they enter their teens. What are the two ideas that the sages have emphasized why a kid becomes bar mitzvah at this age? The ability to think outside of oneself and the ability to care about things outside oneself. Now, look what this scientist has to say. The notion that I don't know why this is black, but okay. The notion that a shift in a child's development occurs around the age of 12 fits with popular models of developmental psychology. One notable example is the work of Jean Piaget, who mapped out 4 stages of a child's cognitive development. He called the final stage, beginning around age 11, the formal operational stage. The notion that a shift in a child's development occurs around the age of 12 fits with popular models of developmental psychology. One notable example is the work of Jean Piaget. I think I'm reading exactly the same thing. The color is appropriate. Who mapped out 4 stages of a child's cognitive development. He called the final stage, beginning around the age 11, the formal operational stage. While children in early years mostly used inductive reasoning, drawing general conclusions from personal experiences and specific facts, at this age, they become capable of deductive reasoning, drawing specific conclusions from abstract concepts using logic. While children tend to think very concretely and specifically in earlier stages, at around 12, they become capable of abstract thought and begin to consider possible outcomes and consequences of actions. So what do we see in this text? That kids are able to think outside of themselves, and they're able to consider the impact of their actions on others and the future. Another scientist. A parallel to Peugeot's work in the field of cognitive development is Lawrence Kohlberg's work on moral development. Kohlberg found that until adolescence, children are motivated primarily by self-interest. They behave well because they are rewarded and avoid misbehaving to avoid punishment. As children enter adolescence, they become more concerned about maintaining relationships and take others people's perspectives and intentions into account when making decisions. They also begin to conform to social standards of behavior and understand right from wrong. So here we see that there's a scientific basis, there's a very rational and logical basis, why at the age of 13 for a boy, 12 for a girl, they have the emotional maturity to be able to appreciate something bigger and greater than them outside of them, the importance of it, and then Torah and mitzvahs is able to become part of their life. In addition to the psychological changes, there are actual physiological changes in the brain. Right? I'm going to skip the text here because it's a little bit technical, but what essentially these texts are saying here is that, in the most simple English, is that when a kid hits that 12, 13-year-old age, the brain starts freeing up space. It starts deleting files. Why? In order that it can manage its information in a more useful fashion, and the brain actually begins to process much quicker. So from a psychological perspective and a physiological perspective, this is the age where the beginning of all of this development begins. All right, so now so far we understand why it's the age of 12 and it's the age of 13. It tracks back to Shimon and Levi, who are described as 13. And we understand from a psychological and physiological perspective what changes are going on in a boy and a girl at that time, that we could call them an adult, at least in terms of Torah and mitzvahs. But we're still left with the question, why do we infer the age for the beginning of religious worship from a bloody and violent event? Why not from a more spiritual experience? So the answer is that it depends how you look at it. From one perspective, it's a bloody and violent event. From another perspective, Shimon and Levi made a powerful demonstration of fierce loyalty. Such fierce loyalty is indispensable to what it means to live and to act and to behave as a Jew. Let's explore this a little bit further. We're going to give a slightly different approach to why the bar mitzvah is at the age of 13 and the bas mitzvah is at 12. We go to the Rosh Rabbeinu Asher. He writes, with respect to your query, how do we know that we only become liable for our transgressions at the age of 13 but not before? Know that this is a ruling that God gave to Moshe on Mount Sinai and was passed down orally through the generations. For God taught Moshe a minimum measure for every requirement in the Torah. The Rosh says, why a bar mitzvah at the age of 13? He does not give any rational or logical explanation. He says it because God told Moshe at Mount Sinai, period. That is the reason why it is at 13. It is a divine order. Now I ask you, is the position of the Rosh arguing with everything we said before? What we stated so far is that bar mitzvahs at this age is a result of empathy and the ability to think outside of yourself. Here, the Rosh is saying, has nothing to do with that. God commanded it, God decreed it, it's a divine order. Are they arguing? No, of course they're not arguing. There are two ways to serve God. Each one is approaching it from a different perspective. What are the two ways to serve God? One is, my service of God is predicated upon understanding, knowledge, logic. I learn, I study, I appreciate, and therefore I do. That's one approach. Understanding is the foundation of Torah, mitzvahs, and my relationship with God. However, there's another approach that what is the foundation of my relationship with God? Obedience, commitment, loyalty. Whether I understand or not. If I don't understand today, maybe I'll understand later. And even if not, that doesn't make a difference because I'm in completely and wholly. Which one is supposed to be the primary motivation? Let's look at what the Rebbe says in the next text. These two opinions about the starting point of our obligation to worship God represent two entry points into divine worship. According to the first opinion, worship should begin from a standpoint of reason and knowledge. The ability to serve God this way depends directly on the state of our intellectual and emotional maturity. Thus, we become obligated to perform mitzvahs when we mature enough to intuit the meaning of the mitzvahs and to relate to them emotionally. According to this opinion, it follows that the portal to divine worship is reason and knowledge. The ability to serve God this way depends directly on the state of intellectual and emotional maturity. Did I just read this? Yeah. Intellectual. All right, I think we're missing a paragraph here, so I'm just going to read it from my book here. The second opinion is that a 13-year-old accepts the yoke of mitzvahs in obedience to a divine edict related to Moshe at Sinai. According to this opinion, it follows that the portal to divine worship is discipline and obedience. So both of these approaches are critically important. We need to use our brains to serve God. We need to have a deep intellectual and emotional understanding of Torah and mitzvahs to relate and connect to God. But at the same time, there has to be that obedience, there has to be that commitment that is going to get us through difficult and challenging times when there is doubt, whether internally or externally. The next text is a very powerful letter that the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote to the Jews of Russia in 1925, a time period of brutal oppression from the communists. It was illegal to practice Judaism. You had to live, act, behave like a communist Russian. And Jews were making compromises in their observance to fit in with the new reality of the Soviet Union. The 6th Rebbe writes, intellectual Jews today must set aside their deductions and refuse to follow their reason and knowledge. This is because they are liable to stray, God forbid, by following the prevailing culture of our time and place and conclude that we must change our practice. With time, this can cause them to stray completely from the true path, God forbid. It might begin with a minor adjustment, but it can lead slowly and progressively to a bitter end, God forbid. We must therefore be fiercely determined, even to the point of self-sacrifice, not to stray even an iota, God forbid, from the code of Jewish law. The Torah is eternal to every era and epoch, and so we must stand firm and never feel shame before those who mock us. The 6th Rebbe says sometimes we need to have commitment, dedication, and loyalty. If we start rationalizing away which mitzvahs we will and won't do due to external circumstances of our life, it is going to fade away and it's going to disappear. You may think the argument is sound. The reality is it's not going to work. There has to be fierce loyalty, obedience, and self-sacrifice. But where does it come from? Where and how does a Jew have the ability to have self-sacrifice, to do something which is illogical, which is irrational, and would appear to harm your self-interest? The answer is it does not come from the mind. It comes from the soul. When do we get the soul? How does that work? The primary and final state of the sacred soul entry into the body is at the age of 13 for a boy and 12 for a girl. This is why they become obligated in the Torah's commandments at that age. So when a boy at 13 and a girl at 12 get that soul which represents obedience, commitment, fierce loyalty to God, that approach to Torah mitzvahs, therefore at the age of 12 and 13, a mature adult? No, not a mature adult. But mature in terms of Torah and mitzvahs, this takes place at the bar mitzvah. So the two things that take place at the ages of 12 and 13, one, the mind develops empathy, the ability to understand things outside of themselves. The soul enters the body, fierce spiritual loyalty, dedication, and commitment. And it's in fact these two factors that we actually learn from the story of Dinah. The Rebbe explains, the concern will our sister be made into a harlot was so distressing to Shimon and Levi that they responded like strangers, like people who were not the sons of Yaakov. They were so consumed by distress over the violation of their sister that their only choice was each man took up his sword. This is precisely why we derive the age of bar and bas mitzvah from this passage. It is a message for every bar and bat mitzvah child. which includes all Jews at the beginning stage of their spiritual progression. The lesson is that when we stray after our hearts and eyes with lustful urges and are tempted to sin, we face the risk of being made into a harlot. Just as a harlotry drives a wedge between a woman and her husband, so does sin form a barrier between us and God. When we are confronted by such temptations, we mustn't tolerate any rational justification or moderate response. Our only response can be stubborn resistance to sin, even to the point of self-sacrifice. Only after being inspired to self-sacrifice do we have the luxury of serving God in a fashion that follows our reasoning and the measured pace of the Torah's dictates. However, for our reasoned service to God to endure, our very first approach, even at the age of bar and bat mitzvah, must be stubborn determination that transcends all reason. So Shimon and Levi demonstrated this incredible empathy for Dinah. They had a fierce commitment to her, and that overtook all considerations. They didn't sit down and logically, rationally think about it. Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? What are the consequences? No. They said, we must defend the honor of our sister, no matter the results, no matter the circumstances. That just has to be. So this is not a story about violence. It's a story about loyalty. And when does this loyalty begin? At the age of 13, a child can have this level of loyalty that transcends logic. We must develop a fierce loyalty to God that transcends every logical reason or explanation, a bond that is simply because it is. The perfect age where this not only begins, but in which to a certain degree is demonstrated so beautifully, is at this age of bar and bat mitzvah. Teenagers can be so stubborn. Teenagers can be so illogical. But this can be applied to Torah, to mitzvahs. Have you ever met a nice bacher that's age 13, 14? They're willing to go into a downtown of any city, go into the tallest office building, go into any office and say, I am here with tefillin. I want to talk to the CEO. Is he Jewish? I want to talk to the boss. I want to talk to the owner. How many attorneys in this office are Jewish? Because this is what takes place at that age. The soul is in, commitment, loyalty, dedication. Bachrim, I'm there. I need to go to Russia to make a Seder, I'm there, right? I need to go to rural Iowa to reach out to Jews. Bachrim are there. This is when it all begins. Adults were a little bit more tempered. Maybe I should make an appointment. Maybe I have to call first. Maybe I have to hire some other people. What does a teenager do? Boom, I'm in if I need to be there. All right, so we answered the first two questions. Why 13? Because this is the age of empathy, and this is the age of fierce loyalty. That's what the story of Dinah is about. It's not violence, it's about loyalty. But what about other nations? How come other nations didn't figure this out, that 13 is the ideal age? Or looking at it from another perspective, 13 is not a mature adult. Why do we choose this age? So the Rebbe explains, Jewish children reach maturity at 13 years of age, unlike other nations, where the age of adulthood is 20, 21, etc. The reason, the nations form their rational identity by first settling on a common land, rather than wandering about or shepherding. Then they appoint a king, and finally establish a constitution and laws. The history of the Jewish people is the opposite. As soon as they left Egypt, while still in the desert, they begin to follow the Torah and its commandments. This was their foundation and portal into nationhood. This is why Jews don't enter into adulthood when they're 20 and strong enough to defend the land. Rather, by the age of 13, when they're mature enough to begin to understand the great privilege and responsibility of being a Jew. From the perspective of other nations, when do you become that full-fledged citizen with privileges? When you can contribute in a productive way to that nation. Sometimes it's 16, sometimes it's 18, sometimes it's 21, it depends where you live. But for a Jew, what is our core identity? Our core identity is Torah and mitzvahs. Therefore, the moment that a Jew is able to experience and to appreciate Torah and mitzvahs and all that come along with it, that is when you become an adult, a man and a woman. That is when you become a full-fledged Jew. So we discussed three things today. Three incredible lessons that are relevant and important to a bar and a bat mitzvah boy, but lessons that are so important for us because this is what it means to live as a Jew. Number one, we have to have empathy, which means we have to be able to think about things that are bigger than us and outside of ourselves. Sometimes we get caught up in our own issues, our own needs in life. We have to remember God created the world for a purpose. There's a reason that we're here. There are Torah, there's mitzvahs, there's a Jewish community, and we have to get involved. We have to empathize. We have to think of things bigger and greater than are outside of ourselves. Point number two, a Jew has to have a fierce loyalty, a commitment, an obedience to Torah and mitzvahs, even if logically, rationally, there may be challenging circumstances to it. We have to have a commitment and a dedication that transcends logic and reason. And finally, lesson number three, we have to recognize that being Jewish is not just something that we do on the side, but this is in fact our core identity, which defines what it means to be a man, to be a woman, is ultimately our relationship with Torah and mitzvahs. Next week, there will not be a live class because I have to be at a Sheva Brachas in Waukesha. But I will record the class and I will post it on YouTube, and it will be emailed to the show. So thank you so much for joining us, and God willing, we will see you soon.